Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In previous lectures, we've talked about the anti-war movement from a number of different perspectives. In this lecture, we're going to talk about civil rights activists and their views on the war. Most civil rights activists opposed the war on a number of different fronts. They argued that the war was upholding a white-dominated society, not just in the United States, but all around the world. The war, in fact, attacked colored people of the entire world, and again, not just the United States. There was also the argument that the war distracted from more important issues on the home front, and that those involved in the civil rights fight needed to focus on issues of equality here at home. Of course, the most famous of the civil rights leaders was Martin Luther King Jr., who became very outspoken against the Vietnam War beginning in 1967. In April 1967, he marched in New York City and gave a famous speech that focused primarily against the war in Vietnam. In that speech, King argued that the war was killing the war on poverty on the home front, as we've already discussed previously with the Johnson administration. He also argued that blacks were being sent in higher numbers into the war, which was certainly true at least early in the war, when the deferment for those who were in college ultimately struck harder on minority communities. He also proposed to minister to black draft dodgers in that speech. Another famous civil rights activist who was prominent in the anti-war movement was the black boxing champion Muhammad Ali, who in March of 1966 famously refused his draft induction. Ali said in part, "My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother, or some darker people, or some poor hungry people in the mud, for big powerful America." For these actions, Ali was stripped of his title and ultimately banned from boxing for about 3 years before he finally returned. These actions robbed Ali of some of the peak years of his career. In the fall of 1967, a national series of protests evolved that led to confrontations with the police. In California, 3,000 protesters surrounded the Oakland Induction Center on October 16th. The police beat them with nightsticks and cleared the area. The next day, the protesters returned. On the third day, some 10,000 people showed up, blocking the streets and ultimately celebrating a victory over violent repression. In Washington, D.C., about 100,000 people demonstrated at the mall and at the Pentagon. They sat down in front of the Pentagon, in front of soldiers, sitting out the night and burning their draft cards. Late in the night, the soldiers and police descended on the protesters, beating them with clubs, arresting many, and dispersing the rest. By 1967, the anti-war movement was spreading across college campuses all over the country. Students would protest against government officials visiting the campuses. They would block their movements and interrupt their speeches. They also campaigned against ROTC programs and sometimes chased recruiters off campus. The numbers of those who enrolled in ROTC programs declined during this era. In early 1967, Stanford University students stood up and left the auditorium during a talk by Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Protests were also moving beyond college campuses. There were attacks against induction centers and symbolic acts against draft boards. From 1968 to 70, there were many attacks, including pouring blood on draft board records, using black spray paint, and sometimes even napalm to start fires. There were also protests within the military itself. Soldiers sometimes refused to leave for Vietnam, refused to train, or refused to follow orders. Desertions mounted, and there was a growing international network designed to harbor deserters. Some soldiers began publishing anti-war cartoons or newspapers. And as I've mentioned, in its most extreme form, soldiers who were frustrated with the war or their superior officers might try to kill them or even succeed in the process known as fragging. Finally, many veterans who returned from the war also then joined the anti-war movement itself. Many of them participated in an organization called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the VVAW. These were veterans who returned from the war so shaken by what they had seen and done that they immediately joined the anti-war movement. Their presence added drama to the anti-war movement and validated it. If the soldiers who fought the war are opposed to it, then we need to reevaluate what's going on. As one writer said, vets could protest with unique authority. They also, in some cases, brought dramatic protests to the protest movement, including things like mock guerrilla theater, or throwing blood or fake blood into the midst of protesters. Some of their actions were very shocking, as sometimes spectators didn't know what was going on or didn't know that it was an act. They would also sometimes throw their medals or other parts of their uniforms or memorabilia as a sign of their disrespect for the process, for the government, and for their role in the war. Certainly, having veterans at the front of the protest movement gave new credibility to those who were protesting against the war. In our next lecture, we'll talk about how the war was reflected in popular culture and how anti-war themes crept into some of those examples of popular culture.